Greetings, it's Barry from DRescapes.com website. It's my pleasure to welcome back James Wesley Rawles. James is internationally recognized as an author as well as the founder of the survivalblog.com website. Survivalblog.com is perhaps the most widely followed website of its kind in the entire world. We thought it would be interesting to compose sort of a fireside chat about the events that have unfolded since our last interview some 7 months ago. Without any further delay, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome back James Wesley Rawles. James, it's great to have you back.
Thanks for having me on, Barry.
Before we get started, I'd like to mention your latest release, Liberators. I understand as of yesterday it's now available at Amazon.com in hardcover. Can you tell our listeners about it?
Sure. Liberators is the fifth novel in my Patriots novel series. It'll probably be the last in the series. It's the longest book in the series, and it ties together a lot of characters from all the other books in the series. Although, like all my other books, it pretty well stands alone. It can be read by itself without having read the others first. Liberators is set mainly in Western Canada, in the Bella Coola region, and there's also a bit in the Seattle, Washington area, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and a bit inside the D.C. Beltway, and a cross-country journey as well. So I think that from a geographic standpoint, it'll draw people's interest. There's a lot of different geography, a lot of different terrain, different climate zones that are described, and very different circumstances that people have to live in the midst of the crunch. You know, from Bella Coola, where it's incredibly lightly populated, their main challenge is not urban looters. Their challenge is the climate, because they live in such a severe climate zone. And then for the people in the D.C. Beltway, their main concern is getting out of town.
Wow. Okay.
So, I think people enjoy it. And I talk a lot about, practical, tactical stuff woven into the storyline. There's always a lot of tactics and techniques and technologies in all of my books. I think people will really like it. And this particular book focuses more on resistance warfare, guerrilla warfare.
I see. Bella Coola is in B.C. That's not all that far from where I hail from, in Alberta.
Yeah. The Western Canada is really an unusual place in that the population density is even lighter than where I live. And I live in one of the most lightly populated portions of the United States. It's interesting that you relocated from Alberta to the Dominican Republic, which has a pretty high population density and a completely different climate. I think you can get an appreciation for the study in contrasts.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I've been out of Canada since '84, living in these various countries, but my take on it could be totally different than most people, but I'm not a big fan of stats because stats quite often don't ask the right question. And I think a more pertinent question is the percentage of population that's into agriculture.
Right.
See, you can have 500-600 people per square mile. If you do the math on a square mile, that's still yielding about 28,000 square feet per person. If you have 30-40% of the people in agriculture, I don't think you have a problem.
Right. Here in the United States, we have a huge problem in that 99% of the population is being fed by 1% of the population. And if we were to have a repeat of the Depression of the 1930s, I think things would get chaotic very quickly. In the 1930s, 20% of the American population was still actively involved in farming, ranching, or fishing. And again, and of course that, they were very easily able to, feed the other 80% of the population. That even if people were out of work, odds are they had country cousins who could help feed them. Well, now we've got 1% of the population feeding the other 99%. Very few people have country cousins. And it's not going to be a situation like in the Dominican Republic where so many people are used to subsistence agriculture. It will be a huge adjustment, and unfortunately, we'll probably see a huge population die-off in the United States in the event of a socioeconomic collapse. In the Dominican Republic, I don't think it's going to be that much different, frankly. You know, there's an old saying, it's awfully easy to get along with what you've never had.
That's so true. Yeah, absolutely. I'm an old gearhead. You know, I love wrenching on old trucks and vehicles. It's my hobby when I'm not working land. But I've always used an analogy that the world is interlinked like the gears of a transmission, and many people don't understand that. But America, no question, is the planetary gear. But the further away you are from it, you're going to lose less teeth when that transmission blows. And my temp gauge has always been the fluid in the transmission. That's the citizens. When the fluid's getting hot, that machine's going to blow. I don't see a temperature change over the last 15 years. Like you said, it's difficult to take away what we never had. I couldn't agree with that more. Moving on, James, it's been about 7 months since our last interview, and so many occurrences have come into play since then, it's hard to know where to begin. I've composed a short list of subjects I'd like for us to touch on, and Jim, please feel free to add in anything that you feel is important, because we're talking from two different ends of the world here. In our last interview, we touched about the economy. Over the last 7 months, volatility has gone through the roof. To me, it's looking like a repeat of '08 or worse, and not that far off into the future. Would you care to share your thoughts on the current volatility in the markets, as well as your thoughts about diversifying part of one's portfolio into hard assets such as precious metals, farmland, or even other nations, and thus eliminating the risk of everything being in the same basket?
Sure. I do agree with you that we are on the cusp of another economic crisis. Just a week ago here in the United States, there was a huge drop in the stock market. And lo and behold, the Federal Reserve announced that they weren't in such a hurry to scale back on quantitative easing after all. I can see that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department are essentially addicted to debt at this point. There's basically no way they can ever get out of the quantitative easing spiral that they're in. And no matter what they do, they'll have to do something to create money out of thin air. Now, I've suggested in my blog that they may officially do away with quantitative easing, but I think they'll somehow have another mechanism to do just exactly the same thing. And I think one very likely possibility is that they'll begin swapping debt with other nations, where essentially we won't do quantitative easing in the States. We may be creating money for foreign governments, and then they'll create money for us in a quid pro quo arrangement. In the final analysis, what's really important is quantitative easing is not going away, which means in the long term, mass inflation and a destruction of the U.S. dollar as a currency unit is inevitable. So that leads me to your next question, which was hard assets. Yes, I'm a big believer in hard assets. I think that precious metals, especially silver, should definitely be part of everyone's portfolio. I'm also a big believer in productive farmland, especially in an area where there's a reasonable growing season, plentiful water, and preferably a light population density.